The courtroom was filled with the usual buzz of whispers as people settled into their seats. The air was thick with tension as the young girl, no older than 16, walked slowly to the witness stand. She wore a plain dress and seemed small in the large, intimidating space. Her heart raced, and she could feel every pair of eyes on her. The judge, known for his sharp tongue and unyielding attitude, watched her with disdain. He was an older man, his hair graying at the temples, and his glasses perched on the edge of his nose as if he had seen it all. He looked down at her with a cold stare, already sizing her up. "Let's get this over with," the judge muttered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. His tone was sharp, as if mocking her mere presence in his courtroom. The girl stood silent, her hands trembling slightly, but she held her head high. She had prepared for this moment for weeks, but it didn't make the situation any easier. "Miss, do you even know where you are?" The judge sneered, his voice echoing throughout the room. He didn't wait for her to answer before continuing. "You think you can just walk in here, looking like that, and expect sympathy?" His words were harsh, cutting through the silence like a knife. The courtroom filled with a low murmur, people watching the young girl with curiosity. She didn't say a word. She simply looked at the judge, her eyes calm but deep with something the judge couldn't read. She had prepared herself for this, but facing the judge's cruel words still felt like a punch to the gut. The judge was known for his lack of patience and even less for his empathy. He had ruined many people's lives with his decisions, but he didn't care. To him, everyone was guilty until proven innocent, especially those who didn't fit his idea of a proper person. The girl shifted slightly, trying to steady her nerves. She had a secret, something no one knew about, and the time to reveal it had come, but she wasn't sure if she could do it. The judge's words were like a wall, pushing her down, making her question if she was truly brave enough to speak the truth. "Do you need a moment to gather yourself?" the judge asked, his voice dripping with mockery. He seemed almost amused by her silence. The room was watching, waiting for her response, but she remained still. His words stung, but she wouldn't let him see how much they hurt her. Finally, the judge grew impatient. "Well, what are you waiting for? Speak up. This is your chance to say something, but I don't think you have anything worthwhile to say, do you?" His voice was loud and cruel, the room growing tense as the tension between him and the girl built. But the girl stayed quiet, not out of fear, but because she knew this wasn't the time. This wasn't the place. She had something far bigger to say, and the moment would come soon enough. The judge rolled his eyes, clearly irritated with her lack of response. He leaned forward on the bench, looking down at her with an expression of disgust. "I don't have time for games," he muttered, his voice stern and impatient. The girl stood still, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't going to let him break her. She had been through too much to let his words destroy her now. She would speak when she was ready, and when she did, it would change everything. The silence between them stretched out longer, making the judge grow even more annoyed. "Are you going to answer or not?" he snapped, his patience wearing thin. The room seemed to hold its breath as the girl slowly lifted her chin, locking eyes with the judge for the first time. She didn't flinch or look away. Her gaze was steady, calm. "I have a lot to say, Your Honor," she finally said, her voice soft, but filled with a quiet strength. The judge looked at her in surprise. He wasn't expecting her to speak. He wasn't expecting her to stand up to him, especially not after all the taunts he had thrown her way. He frowned slightly, clearly thrown off balance by her calm response. "Is that so?" he said, his tone no longer mocking but still condescending. "Let's hear it, then." The girl took a deep breath, her hands still trembling, but her voice strong. "You think I'm just a poor, unimportant teenager. You think I'm nothing. But I'm not. I have a story to tell, and it's one that might change everything." The judge's eyes narrowed, but he remained silent. The courtroom, once filled with whispers, now held a stillness. Every person in the room was waiting, wondering what she was about to say. The girl continued, her voice growing steadier with each word. "You don't know me. You don't know what I've been through. But I'm going to tell you." She paused for a moment, her eyes never leaving the judges. The audience could feel the tension in the air, the anticipation of what was coming next. The judge, still skeptical, leaned back in his chair. He had no idea what he was about to hear, but he knew one thing for sure. This trial was going to be anything but ordinary. The teen began her story, her voice still soft, but slowly gathering strength with each passing word. She spoke of her childhood, one that was far from the normal life most people assumed she had. She had grown up in a small, run-down house on the outskirts of the city. Her mother was barely around, always working long hours to make ends meet, and her father, well, he hadn't been in the picture for years. She had learned early on how to take care of herself. Her friends at school didn't understand. They had their families, their warm homes, their futures set out for them. But for her, everything had been a daily struggle. She spoke of nights spent alone in her room, the weight of loneliness heavier than any backpack she carried. It wasn't the kind of life anyone would choose, and yet it was the only one she knew. But despite it all, she had always hoped for something more. She hadn't let the harsh reality of her world define her. She dreamed of being different, of having a better life, and she knew that one day she would escape. The judge listened intently, but his face remained unreadable. He had heard countless stories of hardship in his time, and he had no reason to believe that hers was any different. He wasn't moved by her words, not yet, but something in her voice, something in the way she carried herself, made him pause. She wasn't like the others who came through his courtroom. There was a quiet resilience in her, something he hadn't expected. She continued, her voice now more sure of itself. "I worked hard, every day, to get through school. I did everything I could to prove that I was worth something, that I wasn't just some girl from a broken home. But people like you, your honor, they never saw that. All they saw was my appearance, my past, and they judged me for it." The judge didn't react. He was still unmoved, still skeptical. But as she spoke, he began to feel a strange discomfort. She wasn't asking for pity, and she wasn't whining about her circumstances. She was simply telling the truth. And for a moment, just a brief moment, he wondered if perhaps he had judged her too quickly. The teen paused, looking down at her hands, gathering the courage to continue. "But that's not the worst part. The worst part is that the people I loved, the ones who meant the most to me, let me down. They were the ones who turned their backs when I needed them the most." She stopped for a second, taking in a deep breath. The audience in the room was silent, all eyes on her, waiting for what she would say next. The judge had begun to lean forward slightly, his earlier arrogance beginning to fade as he listened more closely. He didn't know what this girl's secret was, but he could tell it was something big, something that would make him rethink everything. She went on, her voice trembling slightly now, but not from fear, from the weight of what she was about to reveal. "My mother, she wasn't just a hard worker. She had her own secrets. I found out when I was just 12 that the reason we were always struggling wasn't because of some bad luck. It was because of the choices she made, choices that destroyed our family. And the worst part was, she never told me. She never apologized for it." The judge's expression softened, though only for a second. He didn't know what to make of her words. He had never been one to get involved in personal stories. His job was to judge, to make decisions based on the facts. But there was something raw about this girl, something genuine that made it hard to dismiss her so easily. The girl's voice lowered, almost to a whisper. "I've never told anyone about this. Not until now. But I'm telling you, because I need you to understand something. You can't judge me the way you judge everyone else. You don't know me. You don't know the pain I've lived with." The judge was quiet, his lips pressing together into a thin line. He wasn't used to hearing such honesty in his courtroom. Most people just wanted to get through their cases, to get the judgment they wanted. But this girl wasn't asking for anything. She wasn't looking for sympathy. She was just speaking the truth, and for a moment, the judge felt the weight of it. The judge was quiet, his lips pressing together into a thin line. He wasn't used to hearing such honesty in his courtroom. Most people just wanted to get through their cases, to get the judgment they wanted. But this girl wasn't asking for anything. She wasn't looking for sympathy. She was just speaking the truth, and for a moment, the judge felt the weight of it. The courtroom fell into a deep silence as the girl's words lingered in the air, and the judge sat still, his eyes fixed on her. For the first time in his long career, he couldn't shake the feeling that something in this case was different. This wasn't the usual courtroom drama. He had expected the typical performance, the scared teenager trying to avoid punishment, the nervous apologies, the desperate pleas. But this girl wasn't afraid. She wasn't begging for anything. She was simply telling the truth, and it was shaking him to his core. The girl didn't seem to notice the shift in the room. She simply stood there, her back straight, her gaze unwavering. She had shared a piece of herself with them, something that no one had ever known before. The weight of it all was heavy, but she felt lighter now that the secret was out. She had never planned on sharing this part of her life, but something about the judge's cruelty had pushed her to finally speak up. The judge leaned back in his chair, staring down at his desk for a moment. He had always prided himself on his ability to separate personal feelings from his decisions. He was a judge, after all. He was supposed to be impartial. But now, as he reflected on what she had just revealed, the line between personal and professional had blurred. The girl's story had struck something deep within him, something he hadn't expected, something he wasn't sure he was ready to confront. Finally, he spoke, his voice quieter than before, almost hesitant. "You've told a difficult story, miss, but stories don't change the facts. You still stand accused of." "I know," she interrupted gently, cutting him off before he could finish. "I know the facts, Your Honor. I don't expect you to forgive me or excuse anything I've done. But I want you to understand that the person I am today isn't the same person I was when all of this started." Her voice was calm, but there was a new determination in her eyes. "I'm not asking for your forgiveness. I'm just asking for a chance." The judge's expression hardened again, but only briefly. There was still a part of him that wanted to dismiss her, to return to the cold, efficient justice he had always prided himself on. But another part of him, a part he rarely allowed to surface, felt the stirrings of something different. Was he really seeing this girl for who she truly was, or was he being swayed by her words? Was he letting emotions cloud his judgment? He took a deep breath, trying to push away the doubt that crept into his mind. "You expect me to believe that everything you've done, everything that led you here, was just a mistake." His voice was sharper now, the old judge returning. He wasn't ready to let her off the hook, just because she had shared a painful past. The girl nodded slowly, not afraid of his tone. "Yes, I was lost. I didn't know where to turn. I made mistakes, but I've learned from them. I don't want to keep making the same mistakes. I want to move forward." There was a long pause. The judge glanced around the room, the audience watching him with bated breath. He could feel the pressure mounting on him, and for a moment, he wished he could escape the weight of this decision. But he was the one who had to make it. It was his job. He had to be the one to decide whether or not to offer her a chance at redemption. He looked back at the girl. She was still standing there, calm and composed, waiting for his judgment. She had said her piece. Now it was up to him. But what was the right decision? Could he trust her, or had she simply learned how to manipulate the situation in her favor? The lines between right and wrong were never as clear as they seemed. The judge shuffled some papers on his desk, though it was just a way to avoid looking at her directly. "Your words are persuasive. I'll give you that," he said, his tone more neutral than before. "But this is still a court of law. You're still here for a reason. Your actions have consequences." The girl nodded again, her expression unwavering. She wasn't asking him to forget the law or the consequences of her actions. She was asking him to see her for who she was now, not the girl who had made mistakes in the past, but the woman standing before him, ready to take responsibility and move forward. The room was still, the tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. The judge looked down at the case files in front of him, then back up at the girl. He took one more long look at her, his mind racing with questions, with doubt, with something he couldn't quite name. Was he ready to give her a chance, or had her past sins built a wall that could never be broken down? For a brief moment, the courtroom felt as though time had stopped. Everyone was waiting, hanging on to the next words that would come from the judge's mouth. Finally, the judge spoke, his voice steady but with a hint of something softer, something he wasn't used to feeling. "I will take everything you've said into account," he said slowly. "But this case is not over. I will deliberate, and you will return here in a few days for my ruling." The girl nodded, grateful that he hadn't dismissed her entirely. She wasn't sure what the outcome would be, but at least she had spoken her truth. And no matter what, she knew she had done everything she could. Now she would wait, just like everyone else, to see if the judge would look past her past and see the person she was trying to become. The next few days were excruciatingly long for the girl. Every moment felt like it stretched on forever, each second weighed down by the uncertainty of what would happen in the courtroom. She couldn't stop thinking about the judge's words. He hadn't dismissed her outright, but he hadn't given her a clear answer either. There was still the looming possibility that he would choose to rule against her, to throw away the small chance she had worked so hard to earn. She stayed in her small apartment, pacing back and forth, replaying every word she had said in front of the judge. She had been honest, she had shared her pain, her struggles, and for a brief moment, she had seen a flicker of something in his eyes, a hint of understanding, perhaps even a glimpse of respect. But now, all she could do was wait. There was nothing more she could do. It was in the judge's hands, and she would have to trust that he would make the right choice. Meanwhile, the judge sat in his chambers, the weight of the case pressing heavily on his shoulders. He had reviewed the evidence, listened to the girl's testimony, and thought long and hard about what she had shared. He had always been a man of strict rules, a believer in the idea that justice was blind and impartial. But for the first time, he found himself questioning that belief. This case had brought out something in him that he hadn't expected: doubt. He couldn't shake the image of the girl standing before him, her voice steady, her eyes unwavering. She wasn't like the others who had come before him, pleading for mercy or trying to manipulate the system. She had told her story with dignity, with a quiet strength that had caught him off guard. She had spoken of her mistakes, but she hadn't blamed anyone but herself. She had taken responsibility for her actions, and that was something he rarely saw in the courtroom. As the judge sat at his desk, he found himself thinking back to his own past. He, too, had made mistakes, mistakes that had haunted him for years. He had never shared them with anyone, never let anyone see the cracks in his armor. And yet, this young girl had done something he had never been able to do. She had been vulnerable, exposed herself in a way that made him reconsider his own beliefs. Was he really the man he thought he was? Was he truly capable of delivering justice, or was he just following a set of rules without ever considering the person behind the case? The more he thought about it, the more he realized that the girl's story wasn't just about her. It was about the flaws in the system, the flaws in himself. He had spent so many years upholding the law, but what if the law wasn't enough? What if sometimes justice required more than just following rules? What if it required understanding, compassion, and the willingness to see beyond someone's past? He leaned back in his chair, staring out of the window, lost in thought. The decision wasn't easy. He knew he couldn't just throw everything aside and offer her a free pass. There had to be consequences for her actions, for the mistakes she had made. But he also knew that she wasn't the same person she had been when she first walked into his courtroom. She had shown him that much, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough to give her a second chance. After what felt like hours of reflection, the judge finally stood up, his decision made. It wasn't a perfect answer, but it was the best he could offer. He walked out of his chambers, heading for the courtroom. As he made his way to the bench, he could feel the weight of the room's gaze on him. Everyone was waiting for his ruling, for the verdict that would decide the girl's fate. The girl sat in the front row, her hands tightly clasped in her lap, her eyes trained on the judge. She had done everything she could. Now, all she could do was hope that he would see her for who she had become, not just who she had been. The judge entered the courtroom and took his seat at the bench. The room fell silent, the tension almost unbearable. He looked out at the girl, her face a mixture of nervous anticipation and quiet determination. She was waiting for him, just as everyone else was. The judge took a deep breath, steadying himself. This was the moment of truth. He cleared his throat and addressed the room, his voice firm but without the usual coldness. After careful consideration, I have come to my decision. The girl's heart skipped a beat, but she forced herself to remain calm. She had made it this far. Now she just had to see what the judge would decide. I have taken into account the circumstances of this case, the young woman's past, and her actions since her involvement in this matter, the judge continued. While her actions have consequences, I also believe in the power of redemption. Everyone deserves a chance to change, to learn from their mistakes. The girl's breath caught in her throat. Was he saying what she thought he was saying? The judge paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. Therefore, I have decided to offer a reduced sentence, along with mandatory counseling and community service. This will allow her to make amends, to prove that she is capable of becoming a better person. The girl's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. She couldn't believe it. She had been given a chance, a real chance, to change her life. The judge's words had not been a free pass, but they had given her hope, a hope she hadn't felt in years. The judge turned his gaze toward her. This is your chance. Don't waste it. The girl nodded, a small but sincere smile crossing her face. She would make it count. She would prove him right. Prove to herself and to the world that she could be the person she always dreamed of becoming. As she walked out of the courtroom, her heart lighter than it had been in years, she knew one thing for sure. This was only the beginning of her new life. The days after the judge's decision felt like a whirlwind. The girl, still processing the reality of her second chance, worked tirelessly to fulfill the court's requirements. The community service assignments were grueling at times, cleaning parks, helping at local shelters, but she embraced them all, knowing that each task was another step toward rebuilding herself. Every moment spent in the community made her feel like she was finally making a difference, not just to others, but to herself. The counseling sessions were more challenging. The therapist was kind but persistent, pushing her to confront painful truths she had buried deep within her. She had always been afraid to face the darkness of her past, afraid that doing so would unravel everything she had tried so hard to build. But as the weeks went by, something began to shift. The girl started to realize that confronting her past wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a sign of strength. She didn't have to hide anymore. She could face the broken pieces of her life and still move forward, still grow. The judge had made it clear that he was watching her progress, that he would be following up to ensure that she was fulfilling the terms of her sentence. She didn't want to disappoint him, not after everything he had done for her. His ruling had given her a new sense of purpose, and for the first time, she truly believed that she could change her life. One afternoon, as she was leaving a counseling session, the girl received a letter in the mail. It was from the courthouse. Her heart raced as she opened it, unsure of what to expect. The letter was brief but to the point. She was being given an early release from her community service obligations due to her exemplary progress. She stared at the letter, her mind racing. Early release. She hadn't expected this. It felt like a reward, but also like another test. Could she really be trusted to continue on this path without supervision? The letter also mentioned that there would be a follow-up meeting with the judge, a final check-in to assess her progress. She knew that this was her moment, her chance to prove once and for all that she wasn't the same person who had walked into his courtroom months ago. The day of the meeting arrived quickly. She stood outside the courtroom, her nerves threatening to overwhelm her, but she took a deep breath and pushed them aside. She had earned this. She had worked hard for this moment, and she wasn't going to let fear take it away. When the girl entered the courtroom, the judge was already seated, looking as composed as ever. But when he saw her, there was a slight shift in his demeanor, a flicker of something warmer in his eyes, though he quickly masked it with his usual stern expression. "Miss," the judge said, his voice as authoritative as always, "you've made significant progress. I've been briefed on your community service and counseling sessions. You've completed everything as required. And I've been informed that you've been a positive influence on those around you." The girl smiled slightly, her heart swelling with pride. She had worked hard to make sure that she lived up to the judge's expectations. However, the judge continued, his tone still firm. "Progress doesn't happen overnight. I want to remind you that the real work begins now. You're free from the court's supervision, but that doesn't mean you're free from the responsibility of proving that you've truly changed." The girl nodded, her expression serious. "I understand, Your Honor. I know I have a long way to go. But I promise you, I won't waste this chance." The judge paused for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly as he assessed her. "You've already come further than most people would have expected. I'm not in the habit of offering leniency, but I'll tell you this. You've earned my respect. Keep working, keep proving that you're more than your past mistakes, and I'll trust that you will make something of yourself." Her breath caught in her throat. Respect. The word felt heavy, like a gift she hadn't dared to expect. It was everything she had hoped for, and more. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said quietly, the weight of his words settling in her chest. She meant it with every fiber of her being. For the first time in her life, she felt like she had someone who truly believed in her, even when she didn't believe in herself. The judge stood, and for a brief moment, they both just stood there, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Then he gave a small nod, the corners of his mouth twitching as if he were trying to suppress a smile. "You're welcome, miss," he said, his voice less formal now, as though he had dropped the mask of the stern judge, if only for a moment. "Now go, and make sure you don't squander this chance. The world doesn't owe you anything, but it will give you what you've earned." The girl left the courtroom that day with a renewed sense of hope. The judge's words had solidified her belief that she was on the right path. She was no longer just a girl with a troubled past. She was someone who had fought for her future, someone who had proven that she could rise above her mistakes. As she stepped out into the sunlight, she knew that the real challenge wasn't just about avoiding mistakes in the future. It was about continuing to grow, to learn, and to prove every day that she was more than the girl who had once walked into that courtroom. She was stronger than that. And with every step she took, she was closer to becoming the person she had always known she could be. Months passed since the girl's meeting with the judge, and every day was a new opportunity for growth. She continued to fulfill the community service assignments she had chosen, not because she had to, but because she truly wanted to make a difference. Helping the elderly, tutoring children in underfunded schools, and working at a food bank, it was hard work, but it filled her with a sense of purpose she had never felt before. Her counseling sessions became less about confronting her past and more about building a future. She no longer saw herself as someone defined by mistakes, but as a person who had learned, changed, and was ready to face the world with a fresh perspective. Her counselor noticed the change in her too. "You've come so far," the therapist remarked one day, a soft smile on their face. "I can see the shift in how you carry yourself. You're no longer afraid of your own potential." The girl had worked hard to believe that about herself. It wasn't easy, but with every accomplishment, no matter how small, she began to see the truth of those words. She wasn't defined by what had happened to her, but by what she was doing to change her life. But even as she worked on herself, she knew there was something else she had to do. She hadn't forgotten about the judge. She owed him so much for giving her a second chance, for believing in her when no one else did. And though she had shown progress, she knew that her journey wouldn't be complete until she could show him that she had truly changed. One day, after finishing her shift at the shelter, the girl made her way to the courthouse. It had been a while since she had seen the judge. She wasn't sure if he would even remember her face, but she felt an overwhelming need to express her gratitude, to thank him properly for everything he had done. She entered the courthouse, her heart pounding as she made her way to the clerk's desk. "I'd like to speak to Judge Harris, please," she said, her voice a little shaky but determined. The clerk gave her a curious look. "Judge Harris? Are you sure? He's been very busy lately." "I know," the girl replied, "but I need to speak with him." The clerk hesitated for a moment, then picked up the phone. After a short conversation, the clerk looked back at her. "He'll see you now. Go ahead up to his chambers." Her heart raced as she walked down the familiar hallway, her footsteps echoing in the quiet. She paused outside the judge's office, taking a deep breath. This was it. She was ready to face him. Not as the scared, broken girl who had walked into his courtroom months ago, but as someone who had taken ownership of her life and was determined to prove that she had changed. When the door opened, the judge stood behind his desk, looking every bit as stern as she remembered, but his eyes softened slightly when he saw her standing there. "Miss," he said, his voice neutral but not unkind, "what brings you here today?" The girl stepped forward, her hands trembling slightly. "I came to thank you, Your Honor," she said, her voice steady despite the nerves twisting in her stomach, "for giving me a chance, for believing in me when no one else did. You changed my life. I just wanted you to know that." The judge's expression softened a little more, though he didn't show much outward emotion. He simply nodded, as if processing her words. "It was your decision to change, miss. You made the choice to take responsibility and improve yourself. That's what made the difference." The girl shook her head. "But without your ruling, without you giving me the chance, I wouldn't have had the opportunity to prove myself. You gave me the chance to see that I could be better. And I want you to know that I'm working every day to make sure I live up to that." The judge stared at her for a moment, as if weighing her sincerity. Then, for the first time since she had known him, he smiled, a small, almost imperceptible smile. But it was there. "I'm glad to hear that," he said, his voice warm but still carrying a hint of his usual authority. "But remember, it's not about my decision. It's about what you do with it. I've only given you the opportunity. The work, the growth, that's all on you." The girl nodded, grateful for his words. "I know. I just wanted you to know that I'm doing everything I can. I'm not the same person who stood before you in that courtroom. I won't waste this chance." The judge gave her one last look, his expression unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that let her know he believed her. "Then keep going," he said simply. "Keep proving it every day." The girl left the courthouse that day feeling a sense of peace she hadn't known before. She had done more than just thank the judge. She had shown him that she had earned his trust. She had proven to herself that she was stronger than her past, and she had shown him that she was ready to face whatever came next. As she walked out into the sunlight, she felt a sense of freedom. The weight of her past no longer hung over her. She was free, free to create a future for herself, free to continue growing, and free to live the life she had always deserved. The judge's words echoed in her mind. Keep proving it every day. She was determined to do just that. One step at a time, she would continue on this path, not because she had to, but because she wanted to be the person she had always known she could be. And with each new day, she was one step closer to that person. It wasn't the end of her story. It was just the beginning. The girl's life, now brimming with purpose, continued to unfold in ways she hadn't imagined possible. The community service, the counseling sessions, and the small acts of kindness she performed every day had become her new normal. They weren't just requirements anymore. They were the building blocks of a future she was creating for herself. And though there were days when doubt crept in, she reminded herself of the progress she had made. There was no turning back now. As time passed, she started to notice the subtle changes in herself. Her confidence grew with every positive interaction she had. People who once judged her now saw someone who was genuinely trying to make amends, someone who was capable of kindness and self-reflection. The girl had become a symbol of change in her community, a quiet testament to the power of redemption. She found a part-time job at a local bookstore, which quickly became her refuge, a place where she could escape into the pages of the books she loved. It wasn't much, but it was hers, and for the first time in a long while, she felt proud of her achievements. She saved up a little money, enough to move into a small apartment closer to the bookstore. It was a step forward, a sign that she was beginning to live the life she had always dreamed of. But there was still one thing she hadn't done. She hadn't fully forgiven herself. Despite everything she had accomplished, she still carried the weight of her past, the guilt of the mistakes she had made. It was an invisible burden, one she couldn't quite shake, no matter how much she tried to move forward. One evening, after closing up the bookstore, the girl sat in her apartment, staring out the window. The city lights twinkled below, a reminder of how far she had come. But as she gazed into the night, she felt a pull to visit the courthouse again. Not to see the judge this time, but to stand in the place where her journey had truly begun. She needed closure, needed to see that the person she was now had truly come from the person she had been. When she entered the courthouse, it was nearly empty. The clerk at the desk greeted her with a polite smile. But the girl didn't come for a meeting this time. She simply needed a moment of reflection. She walked through the familiar hallways, memories of her past flooding back. It was strange, standing there now, knowing how different she was. But she couldn't deny that the journey that had started in that courtroom had led her to this point, this moment where she was finally beginning to forgive herself. She stepped into the courtroom, the place where it all had happened. It felt almost surreal to be there, standing in the room where she had faced the judge and where her second chance had been given. The girl stood alone in the silence, taking a deep breath. It was time to let go of the guilt that had held her for so long. She wasn't perfect, and she didn't need to be. She had changed, and that was enough. For the first time, she allowed herself to embrace her journey, not just the end result, but the entire process. Every mistake, every lesson learned, every step forward had led her to this point. She had earned her place in the world, and it was time to accept that. As she walked out of the courtroom, her heart felt lighter than it ever had before. She didn't need to prove anything to anyone, not to the judge, not to the people around her, and not to herself. She had already done the work. She had already shown that she was capable of change. The next day, as she opened the bookstore for the morning shift, a thought occurred to her. She was no longer the girl who had stood before the judge, trembling with fear and uncertainty. She was someone new, a person who had embraced her past, learned from it, and moved forward with strength. And as the first customer walked into the store, she smiled. Not because everything was perfect, but because she finally understood the power of redemption. It wasn't about never making mistakes again. It was about growing, learning, and finding the courage to move forward no matter what. This was her new beginning, and with each new day, she was ready to continue proving that change was possible, for anyone willing to work for it.